Today, the student debt crisis reached $1,986,945,000, well, and some change. That total debt is held by more than 44 million Americans. So I'd like to start today with gratitude, a statement of gratitude to invoke abundance, in the face of this, the topic of our conversation today, which is the opposite of that. Gratitude first to Stephanie Marcotte for reaching out to me and striking the match of creating this event in the first place. Certainly when I first had the idea and the intention to create Forever in Your Debt, that intention was not only to visualize the largely intangible burden of student debt, but also to generate constructive dialogue regarding how we might collectively work to bring about a truly affordable, sustainable, and accessible future with respect to higher education, both here in Massachusetts, of course, and also nationwide. As such, I am excited that my work can serve as the catalyst for convening this group of students, educators, administrators, legislators, and activists to advocate for meaningful change. And I would also like to express gratitude to all of those whom I've met over the last couple months now that we've been meeting online, working to bring this event into being. So thank you all, and thank you all for being here today. I will begin with this image of myself as a high school senior, which I actually asked my mom to go hunting for in my photographic archive upstairs in our family home. This is me speaking at my graduation as valedictorian of the George Washington High School class of 1995 in Danville, Virginia. And I wanted to bring this out, I think, partly because as a child of the late 70s and early 80s, I think the timeline of my life maps very neatly onto the blooming of this particular crisis. As I've done extensive research over the last few years, as I've developed these projects about student debt, I have really only learned in hindsight how much this phenomenon has kind of transpired concurrent with my own life. That starting in the 70s, massive social supports were being cut, and just collectively we were, as a public, being encouraged to take on more consumer debt. And then the implications of this for the debt burden of individuals, and that paired with the fact that the cost of education has risen at 8 times the rate of inflation in the last 30 years. I think the other panelists have spoken very deeply to a lot of the intricacies of this issue. Given that they've done that so beautifully and so thoroughly, I think I will try to avoid being redundant with some of those points. And speak more so to my personal experience. So as this student who loved school and was a voracious reader and was very academically inclined, art classes always felt like somewhat of a luxury to me. I was definitely somewhat of an oddball among my group of, my peers of AP students, in that I was still pursuing art, and also actually as an extracurricular activity, still pursuing study of dance throughout my secondary school years. I stuck with these things because they brought me a level of fulfillment that I did not readily experience through other channels. Art making was, I would say, where I first experienced what I would now term a flow state. I didn't know that language at the time, but certainly I think that is what art offered me. It also offered me, a really rich experience of critical thinking and problem solving. And I understood that there was a lot of potency in operating in that realm that was, sometimes murky and unknown and a little bit intimidating because of that. But I think for me, sometimes it felt like the academic, what I was used to in the classroom, it challenged me to a certain extent. But I felt like art making and applying my sort of creative inspiration definitely expanded what I was learning in the classroom. So following undergrad, I moved to Japan for what I thought would be a year of teaching English on the JET program. I had attended Duke University as an undergrad. I grew up in Southern Virginia, right on the border with North Carolina. And I think my case, I think, very clearly illustrates some of the complexities of the student debt crisis in the sense that for me, it was actually going to cost pretty much the same amount out of pocket to attend my state school, University of Virginia, as it was going to cost me to attend Duke, which I had, obviously worked very hard to receive an acceptance to. And so, I think this is one of the ways in which, because I was, as so many of the others here today, a Pell Grant recipient, first woman in my family to go to college, first person to attend a four-year university. And I think that, all of these things combined to make me want to pursue the highest level of education that I could attain. And so for me, especially given that the cost out of pocket was going to be the same, it certainly made sense to choose Duke. I will say here today, particularly given the nature of this event, that I think had there been, had the University of Virginia, for example, in this instance, been offered to me as a debt-free education, I feel quite sure that I would have taken that option instead. And I think that that's part of why this endeavor and these efforts here in the Cherish Act and under the umbrella of Higher Ed for All are so deeply important. But I will now look back to Japan. I think that I kept trying to veer away from art. Even in undergrad, I kept trying to pursue other interests that seemed quote unquote more practical, things that would sort of most capitalize, I will use that word intentionally, on my education and the sort of brand of Duke. But ultimately, I kept getting sort of grabbed, by art. And even at Duke as an undergrad, as I was majoring in Spanish, kept also taking classes in art. And my deal with myself was that I could major in art as long as I also majored in something else. And so, again, graduated and went to Japan, where I intended to pursue other things. I went there really with an eye toward broadening my language skill set, living abroad, gaining more extensive experience abroad, and thus being able to potentially pursue international relations or a career in international service. And so I end up in rural Japan, and what finds me again but ceramics and art. So I spent what ended up being 5 years in Japan, continuing to study Japanese and learn Japanese, but also simultaneously studying ceramics and the traditions there. And clay eventually became my primary medium. It's not my only medium. But part of the story of my time in Japan is also that I was paying down my student debt. I had graduated from Duke with about $35,000 owed, and part of the appeal of going to Japan in particular, as counseled by my career advisor at Duke, was that I would be able to have this experience abroad, gain another language, but that I would be paid a very decent salary for teaching English there in the public schools through what is known as the JET program. So while I was there, I was sending money home regularly, and that actually relates to this first project. So sorry, that went quickly. I am skipping forward here in time by quite a bit, but because this project relates specifically to that first experience of student debt, it feels very important. So this work is entitled Beg, Borrow, Steal, and it is in specific relationship to that undergrad debt of $35,000. So this piece is actually, as you can see, a triptych of oversized sheets of notebook paper, composed of actual dollar bills, each of them with a different repeated statement. And so the writing on them, hopefully reminds you somewhat of the sort of punishment of being made to write lines on in elementary school way back when. And I wanted to bring this notion of punishment and sort of punitive quality of debt into relationship with my lived experience of this debt. So on these 3 sheets of paper are statements. The first reads, "I will not beg for forgiveness." The second one reads, "You will not steal our promise." And the third reads, I have to remind myself, or we will not borrow against our futures. And so I'll read you part of the label for this, just because it clearly explains why I did this. So during this teaching job in Japan, my annual salary totaled between $25,000 and $27,000 per year, depending on fluctuations in the exchange rate. Because I was determined to eliminate my educational debt as quickly as possible, I sent remittances equaling roughly 40% of my monthly pay back to the US to be paid toward my student loans over the course of the 3 years I spent teaching there. So that is actually the sum of bills that I used to create this work. Had I been able to invest a single installment of those payments back in 1999, that original $960 monthly installment would hypothetically have totaled $2,638 at the end of 2019, which was the year I made this work, based on average S&P rates of return, reflecting 20 years of growth at that point. And if annual returns hold for the remainder of my professional life, the next 20 years, that same investment would have ultimately grown to $9,706. So that sum is then the price of this work. So should it sell, the buyer would have the option to pay me all at once or to pay me in installments over the remainder of that 40-year period. But should it not sell, I will dismantle the work once that time has elapsed in order to render the currency viable again. So it always feels important to me to note that no bills were irrevocably harmed in the making of this work. I was deeply committed to not destroying the money, and I actually only had the funds to create this piece because I was in a fellowship program where I was allotted a materials budget, and I was able to frame this as material that I needed. So essentially all of these bills were treated as material, artistic material. And now I will tell you a little bit about the current project that's in the gallery, and we will proceed together out there in just a moment. But in the fall of 2012, 3 years after I had completed my master's degree, I traveled to France for a work opportunity. I was very much kind of piecing together whatever I could at that moment in time to conjure a livelihood. And so, and I will say, I graduated from grad school in 2009 in the heart of the financial crisis. And so it was definitely not the neat trajectory that I had imagined for myself, that I would be able to pursue an MFA with the intention to teach at an institution of higher education. Those jobs simply were not available when I graduated. There were very few that were open at that time, and even since, I would say a lot of ceramics programs in particular have been getting shuttered across the country, although that's starting to bounce back now, thankfully. But while I was there, I was really starting to make functional pottery again for the first time in a while. While I was in grad school, I had kind of departed from doing that and was really trying to work more sculpturally and think about how I might engage social issues through my work. But I will say that for me, I think this project really was deeply satisfying to me as an artist because it combined these two things that in my mind had long been unassociated, which were my this deep training and in a traditional practice that I had engaged in Japan, this accrual of skill and craftsmanship, and it brought that into dialogue with the conceptual training that I had at the Rhode Island School of Design. And I don't think I would be standing here today if it were not for that master's degree and my experience of grad school. And so I think to echo what so many others before me have said today, I think that there is immense value in pursuing higher education in whatever subject. I feel it particularly so in art, and I think that ultimately this is what is at stake when we talk about a sustainable future for higher education. I certainly never thought that I would be making artwork about economics, and yet it was what was compelling me. It was what was sort of driving my internal questioning about how it is that we as a society value someone's labor, value their time and energy and their output. And I think I was also bumping up against this a lot in my own life with respect to how my labor as a creative, even if I was doing work for other people, being hired to create molds or other apparatus for the studio, that labor was kind of constantly questioned, when in fact I think it's a viable skill, much like that of a plumber or a hairstylist. I think we need a rich and nuanced and layered society, and ultimately I think that the current ecosystem that we have, which weights people down with these huge amounts of debt, is basically holding captive this massive amount of potential ingenuity, creativity, inspiration that is ultimately affecting us all. Because when that's being held captive, it's not rippling out into society in the way that it could and that it should, and that we would all benefit from ultimately. So I will leave us there. This is what we will see momentarily when we walk out into the gallery. We do have just a few more minutes. So we will transition to the space, and I will share a couple last remarks out by the work, and then I would love to answer any questions that you have, or hear any stories that you have that you might want to share and offer up. Thank you so much.